One journalist, one con artist, one marriage of convenience. Our moment in crime is the murder of Viola Herms Drath. Albrecht Jerome Muth wasn't afraid to hurt his wife. He wasn't afraid to threaten her, which once caused Viola Herms Drath to run down a hallway in a Scottish castle in her underwear. Speaking to the Washington Post through emails, Muth once described his marriage to Viola as one of convenience. Despite the fact that Muth had served time for assaulting Viola, she described her marriage in an unpublished memoir called A Thoroughly Muddled Marriage, Report of an Inmate, as one built on genuine love and that the fights were worth it. But Viola's family were less enamoured with Muth. They didn't attend the couple's April 1990 wedding and only visited Viola in her Washington, D.C. home when Muth wasn't around. In fact, those who knew Viola described Muth as someone who, quote, tried to climb Washington's social and political ladders, often gaining an advantage from his wife's status or from carefully crafted stories that usually held a kernel of truth, but upon inspection did not hold up. End quote. By all accounts, the marriage seemed odd to outsiders. Viola and Muth would even sleep in separate beds in the same bedroom. Viola was 70 years old when she married Muth. He was 26. But Viola did not die of natural causes or illness, as one might expect from a woman in her 90s. Viola died at the hands of her husband. Viola Herms was born on the 8th of February 1920 in Dusseldorf, Germany. She learned English while on vacation and at a Scottish boarding school. In Germany, she wrote plays. Farewell Isabel was staged in Munich and Straubing's Municipal Theatre. After World War II, she became a German interpreter based in Munich. It was while visiting Lake Constance in Switzerland that she met her first husband, Lieutenant Colonel Francis S. Drath, who was the U.S. Deputy Military Governor of Bavaria at the time. Her marriage took Viola to Lincoln, Nebraska. At the University of Nebraska, Viola studied for an advanced degree in literature and philosophy. It was in Nebraska that Viola began to show talent as a journalist, and it was this talent that would eventually prompt a move to Washington, D.C. In Nebraska, she became a political correspondent for the German newspaper Handelsblatt and a commentator for KUON-TV, amongst other journalistic endeavours. In Washington, D.C., Viola and her husband bought a house at 3206 Q Street, located in the Georgetown district, to raise their 2 daughters in. It was in Washington, D.C. that Viola began to write for the Washington Dossier, focusing on political gossip, lifestyle advice, and culture. Viola soon turned her attention to the political scene and became a well-known person in German-American relations over the coming decades. She became a member of the Executive Committee of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and was also a foreign policy advisor during the 1988 Bush presidential campaign. And her ambitions didn't stop there. Viola taught at the American University, lectured at the University of Southern California, wrote 8 textbooks read in over 150 colleges and universities, became involved in diplomacy, wrote articles for many publications, and won several awards. Viola was a woman who lived life to the fullest. But as with us all, Viola experienced her share of heartache. Frances Drath died of cancer at the age of 81 on the 11th of January 1986. Viola was so devastated that she vowed never to bury another mate. It was then that Albrecht Muth became more of a fixture in Viola's life. Viola met Muth in the early 1980s. At the time, he was an unpaid intern from Germany. After Frances died, Muth began to visit Viola at her home. They would talk over tea, and Muth would sing songs to Viola while playing the baby grand piano. When Muth showed up unannounced one day at Viola's home, dressed in a tuxedo and holding a bottle of Moet, he proposed marriage. Viola accepted. And with his marriage to Viola came Muth's arrival into Washington society. But with that arrival came an abundance of lies. Muth was no stranger to telling tall tales, and he would later be described as a spellbinding storyteller and a masterful manipulator by mental health experts. Muth used a fictional relationship with a senator to persuade a Virginia Supreme Court judge to marry him and Viola. It wasn't uncommon to see Muth walking around his neighbourhood, carrying a swagger stick and wearing the uniform of a brigadier general in the Iraq army. Muth would tell people that he was a general in the Iraq army, but detectives would later reveal that his uniform was made by a tailor in South Carolina, and that the certificates that showed he was an Iraqi general were made in a Maryland copy shop. The Iraq embassy in Washington, D.C. would later say they had no connection to Muth. But that didn't stop Muth from organising events in D.C. he claimed were for the Iraqi regime. In 2011, Muth arranged a ceremony at the Arlington National Cemetery to honour fallen American soldiers in Iraq. Then there was the time that Muth officially changed his name to Count Albie after he claimed an elderly German count had fallen from an elephant in India and needed to appoint a successor before dying. The lies kept on coming. He once said he was an East German Foreign Intelligence Service agent. When he began wearing an eye patch, he told people he'd lost an eye while fighting as a mercenary in South America. He then stopped wearing the eye patch, and Muth would continue to lie after he had killed Viola. In reality, Muth was an unemployed man living off a $2,000 monthly allowance from his wife, an allowance that had decreased in the run-up to Viola's murder. Muth would often become violent after drinking, and the violence sometimes led to breakups. Even if Muth moved out, he would always move back into the home Viola liked to host parties in for politicians, foreign diplomats and businessmen. A graduate student who once boarded in Viola's house told of how one night Viola burst into his room and said that Muth had threatened to hit her. Viola once reported to the police that her husband had hit her over the head with a chair. As with many cases of domestic violence, the outburst eventually resulted in Viola's death. Muth called 911 at 7:56 a.m. on the 12th of August 2011. He said that Viola had fallen and hit her head in a second-floor bathroom at home. But the lies that Muth was so fond of telling were about to lead to his downfall. The first error Muth made was informing a relative of Viola's that he was due to inherit $150,000 from Viola's estate, according to a letter he sent to her family. He had forged Viola's signature. It would later be revealed that a prenuptial agreement and Viola's will stated that Muth would inherit nothing. Then Muth sent an email to around 40 friends and associates. The email read, "I am sad to advise that my dear wife of nearly 25 years passed last night. Funeral arrangements are pending." Muth sent the email on the 12th of August, the day that Viola was found dead. The authorities picked up on Muth's reference to her passing the night before. In an obituary Muth sent to the Washington Post on the 13th of August, Muth said his 91-year-old wife died of a head injury she'd suffered in a fall. He also listed her date of death as the 11th of August. But the autopsy was not completed until the 13th of August, which ruled Viola's cause of death as strangulation and blunt force injuries. A broken-off thumbnail and scratches on her neck indicated that Viola had fought for her life. Crucially, her date of death was only determined as the 11th of August, the same day her autopsy was completed, the 13th. There was no sign of forced entry in the home, and Muth had no alibi. It also became clear to the authorities that Viola's body had been moved into the bathroom from a different room. Muth had searched the internet for flights to Iceland and for information on Mexican extradition arrangements and Canadian border crossings after Viola died. All of this, plus the fact that Muth had a history of violence towards his wife, caused the police to suspect he was the one responsible for Viola's murder. After being locked out of Viola's home, Muth began sleeping in Montrose Park and spent time wandering around Georgetown. He was just a few blocks away from Viola's home when he was arrested and charged with second-degree murder on the 16th of August. At a pre-trial hearing in November 2011, Muth did his best to tell Russell F. Cannon, a judge at the D.C. Superior Court, that Viola's death was the result of a hit ordered by Iranian agents. Muth had recently fired his attorneys and asked Judge Cannon if he could represent himself at trial. In order to determine if he was competent to be his own attorney, Judge Cannon asked Muth a series of questions. Muth revealed he was born in Germany, was not a US citizen, majored in international relations and pre-law at college, and had never been treated for a mental illness. When asked about his time spent in the army in Iraq, Muth said he'd served in the army for over a year, but couldn't reveal more, as it would have political implications. Muth took the time to complain about the conditions in jail. He reported that there were fleas, stagnant water, little to no heat, and few opportunities to bathe. At the end of the hearing, it was ruled that Muth could represent himself at trial. The trial, however, had to be pushed back. At the pre-trial hearing, Muth had mentioned that if he died in jail, his body should be sent to a US Army liaison, and that he would now begin to fast. Muth kept to his word, and after a 40-day hunger strike, Judge Cannon ordered Muth to undergo psychiatric evaluation. Muth said his fasting had been ordered by the Archangel Gabriel, and while committed at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Muth began to write a memoir containing his account of Viola's death. He called his memoir Judgment at Washington, Triumph of Illusion, a journal of life in D.C., and noted that he wanted Leonardo DiCaprio to play him in the movie adaptation of his book. Muth was ruled competent to stand trial, and psychologist Mitchell H. Huguenet wrote that Mr. Muth built his entire life by constructing multiple and often simultaneous false narratives, tales within tales, like Russian nesting dolls. His well-developed skills as a con artist have been honed over at least 3 decades. Muth's hunger strike eventually backfired on his plans to be his own attorney at trial. He once weighed 200 pounds, and by the start of the trial he weighed just 92 pounds. Muth was too weak to attend the trial, and Judge Cannon ruled that he could no longer represent himself. Eating food like butter and sugar kept Muth's organs functioning. Force-feeding him could send Muth into shock, and simply moving him could kill him. Instead, Muth participated in the trial by video link from a hospital bed. The trial was the first ever in the DC Superior Court in which the accused wasn't present in the courtroom. Prosecutors Glenn Kirshner and Laura Back had been successful of seeking a first-degree murder charge instead of a second-degree one. Defense attorneys Dana Page and Craig Hickine argued that there was no proof that Muth had killed Viola. A forensics expert who testified for the defense said that Muth's DNA was not present at the murder scene or on Drath's body. After 6 days, the jury retired in order to deliberate. When the jury of 9 men and 3 women announced that, after 3 hours of deliberation, they had found Muth guilty of first-degree murder, Viola's family hugged. Muth received a 50-year sentence. The actor Christoph Waltz is reportedly making a film about Viola's murder. He is set to direct it and play Muth. Viola's home was put up for sale for $995,000 in 2013. Even at 91 years old, Viola had shown no sign of slowing down. At a social outing days before she died, Viola spoke of an upcoming family dinner at the Prime Rib on K Street and her great-granddaughter's first birthday. In an article published in the Washington Post, journalist Josh White spoke of how Drath was determined not to let her age, or anything else for that matter, slow her down. Her wit sharp and her health steady, Drath navigated the worlds of journalism, foreign policy, art, fashion, travel and Georgetown life with the ease and style of someone decades younger. She still had dreams and aspirations, and she was determined to keep on proving that anything can be achieved as long as you put your mind to it.